History as it happens, May 16th, 2023. From Saddam to the sanctions.
This is the first assault on the new world that we see. The first test of our mettle.
The crisis in the Persian Gulf can be resolved in a nonviolent manner through the continuation of strong economic sanctions against Iraq.
50,000 children in Iraq have died prematurely every year. 500,000 since the war, since the sanctions began.
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
When Americans reflected on the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, their minds focused on what happened after March 20th, 2003. But the U.S. had been at war against that country since 1990. Economic warfare, by imposing the most punishing sanctions regime in modern history on a sovereign state. This was the invisible war to American eyes, but its consequences continue to be felt today. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
People had to sell everything they had, the furniture. Other people had to sell the doors in their home to provide for their families. In some very extreme cases, people had to sell body organs. And I cannot confirm this, but there were stories going around that some people had to sell a child so that they can have some source of income.
We gather tonight, witness to events in the Persian Gulf as significant as they are tragic. In the early morning hours of August 2nd, following negotiations and promises by Iraq's dictator, Saddam Hussein, not to use
On
force.
September 11th, 1990, President George Bush delivers his New World Order speech.
And today that new world is struggling to be born. A world quite different from the one we've known. A world where the rule of law supplants the rule of the jungle. A world in which nations recognize the shared responsibility for freedom and justice. A world where the strong respect the rights of the weak.
With the Cold War ending and the U.S. an unrivaled superpower, Bush envisioned a rules-based system of international cooperation where no tin-pot dictator could get away with invading another country.
That how we manage this crisis today could shape the future for generations to come. The test we face is great, and so are the stakes. This is the first assault on the new world that we seek, the first test of our mettle. Had we not responded to this first provocation with clarity of purpose, if we do not continue to demonstrate our determination, it would be a signal to actual and potential despots around the world.
Most people in Iraq did not hear the president's speech, but they would soon feel the consequences, because their leader, Saddam Hussein, had violated the new rules. Saddam had sent his armies into Kuwait the month before. Much of what I'm going to tell you here is informed by the work of Joy Gordon, a philosophy and ethics professor at Loyola University, whose 2010 book, The Invisible War, documents the sanctions regime imposed by the United States through the UN Security Council. As she writes on page 87, what I want to explore is the question of how a human catastrophe of this magnitude came about, what the policies and practices were that caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, decimated the health of several million children, destroyed a whole economy, made a shambles of a nation's education and healthcare systems, reduced a sophisticated country in which much of the population lived as the middle class in a first world country to the status of fourth world countries, the poorest of the poor, such as Rwanda, Somalia, Haiti, and in a society notable for its scientists, engineers, and doctors, established an economy dominated by beggars, criminals, and black marketeers. Consider the rate of child mortality, writes Gordon. According to most of the studies undertaken by researchers, at least 500,000 children under age 5 who died during the sanctions period would not have died under the Iraqi regime prior to sanctions. In 2002, Gordon gave an interview to C-SPAN's Washington Journal as the next Bush in the White House prepared to shift from economic warfare to a military invasion.
The U.S. has been so aggressive in blocking humanitarian goods that the total amount that has been allowed under the Oil for Food program because of U.S. blocks comes out to, I think, $22 billion for the last 6 years. That comes out to $170 per person per year. That's about 1/2 the per capita income of Haiti.
Soon we'll be joined by someone who lived under Saddam and the sanctions, Sarhang Hamasaeed, an Iraqi native who now works for the U.S. Institute of Peace here in Washington. We will also talk to him about Iraq's future as its people try to put the horrible past behind them. That is coming up in a bit. The way the sanctions regime worked gave the U.S. the power to get its way over the objections of other Security Council members until very late in the game. During the 1990s, the sanctions grew more and more unpopular among UN member states, but they neither had the authority nor megaphone to persuade the United States to change course under Bush, Clinton, and then Bush the younger. 3 career UN officials resigned over the sanctions, including Dennis Halliday, the UN's humanitarian coordinator in Iraq until 1998 when he quit.
Can you imagine what it must do to an Iraqi family to have to decide which daughter goes into prostitution? Some mothers, widows, or single parents are forced to sell themselves, sometimes for payment in kind, food or clothes, from Jordanian truck drivers bringing supplies into the country. Can you imagine the impact on the family and on the children now and in the years ahead? That kind of social damage will not heal quickly, if ever.
Inside the United States, reports that Iraqi children were dying in droves from the lack of food and medicine were met with indifference, denials, or yes, but we have to contain Saddam. Madeleine Albright on CBS's 60 Minutes with Leslie Stahl, 1996.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. You know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Albright once said she cared more about the children of Iraq than Saddam Hussein did. But as Joy Gordon writes, the human damage was never a factor in U.S. policy, except insofar as it presented a political liability for U.S. administrations. During the 14 years of the sanctions regime, Congress held 3 hearings, 3 on the humanitarian crisis. It never passed any meaningful legislation to alleviate it. Most members of Congress simply didn't care or believe sanctions, at least at first, were a better choice than going to war, as then Representative Bernie Sanders said in a speech on the House floor opposing Operation Desert Storm in January 1991.
It is my belief that the people of Vermont are overwhelmingly convinced that the crisis in the Persian Gulf can be resolved in a nonviolent manner through the continuation of strong economic sanctions against Iraq, sanctions which are rapidly destroying the Iraqi economy and Saddam Hussein's war-making capabilities.
Around the same time, New York Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan was one of a few who said that sanctions were like an act of war. As he said, nothing works like famine.
This is not a kinder, gentler form of diplomacy. Economic sanctions can be brutal. We have only just begun to thought of the implications and have to do. No more brutal than warfare, but a form of warfare.
But as mentioned, such views were rare. Throughout the 1990s and into the next decade, Congress paid little attention to what was going on inside Iraq, where Saddam was viewed as evil and to blame for whatever problems his people faced. The lack of adequate food, medicine, construction equipment, drinking water purification, sewage. Pretty much anything that could help Iraq rebuild after the 1991 war was blocked by the United States. Michigan Congressman David Bonnier was one of the few American officials who tried to keep the suffering in the public eye. In 2002, he held a news conference to talk about what he had seen on a trip to Iraq as the U.S. prepared to invade.
We wanted to look and see what the sanctions had done to the country and the people of Iraq. They have been horrific. As I have said on numerous occasions, and I hope you will look into, 50,000 children in Iraq have died prematurely every year, 500,000 since the war, since the sanctions began. We went to hospitals to look at the effects on malnutrition, low birth weights in babies. Before the war, 4%, now 25%.
As Joy Gordon concludes, the economic sanctions imposed on Iraq by the UN Security Council may well lay claim to be the worst humanitarian catastrophe ever imposed in the name of global governance. The unconscionable human damage done by those sanctions is routinely dismissed as the unintended consequence of a well-intentioned policy from the past, which has since given way to more nuanced and humane measures. But in fact, Gordon writes, the Iraq sanctions program is the template for the systemic, devastating sanctions we see in place today, albeit in a subtler and more circuitous form. When the anniversary of the U.S. invasion rolled around in March, you'll remember I produced a series of episodes, and you're welcome to go listen to those if you missed them. I interviewed Andrew Bacevich, Gaith Abdul-Lahad, and Melvin Leffler, but I always intended to return to the subject throughout the year. It's simply too important to pay fleeting attention to during the week of the anniversary and then just forget about it. We're not going to do that here. By the way, I did invite Professor Joy Gordon onto the podcast, but unfortunately, because of her schedule, we weren't able to make that happen. Sarhang Hamasaeed is the Director of Middle East Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace here in Washington. He is a professional peacebuilder and a regular lecturer at the Foreign Service Institute on the subjects of ISIS and challenges to governance in Iraq. Sarhang Hamasaeed, welcome to the Washington Times.
Thank you for having me.
I see you survived New York Avenue.
I have.
So we'll get into your work at USIP in a moment, but just tell us a little bit about yourself. You're from Iraq.
Yes, I'm an American citizen today, but I'm originally from Iraq, from Sulaymaniyah. I was born there in 1976. Sulaymaniyah is part of the country that is known to the locals and to a lot of other people as the Kurdistan region.
So you're from northern Iraq then?
I am.
Born in 76. Well, we have something in common. I was born in 75. We're about the same age. You know, when I was preparing for this interview, I have so much to get to about the sanctions and your work at USIP, but really I was curious, what was it like living under Saddam? Because he comes to power a couple of years after you were born.
Unfortunately, much of my time in Iraq was marked by fear. And I think as I grew older and I learned about how author Kenan Makiya wrote a book called Iraq, The Republic of Fear, it was a true republic of fear. The first stories that I remember were that my parents, my grandparents were telling me was about displacement and war and all kinds of problems because of how the state was using force against people, destroying villages. And I was hoping that my life would be different than their story, but unfortunately it wasn't. My early memories start with the Iraq-Iran war. I was 4 years old when that 8-year war broke out, and for much of my childhood I was concerned when I will be drawn to the front line of those wars.
In what ways did you experience the war? Did it reach your part of the country?
It certainly did. If I let my imagination and my memory set free, it defaults back to a day at the beginning of the war in Sulaymaniyah where there was an Iranian fighter jet in the sky and it bombarded my city at the time. Sulaymaniyah is located on the border with Iran. So by 1987, 1988, the front line of the war with Iran has gotten so close where we were in artillery range of the Iranian artillery. The Kurds and the Kurdish Peshmerga, the fighting force that is known, those who face death, were fighting Saddam. And so there was a second front line, which was an internal front line that Saddam was fighting the Kurds and suppressing. And the third front line was the intelligence of Saddam. The nightmare of my mother was when I would go out and who are my friends. And if somebody will be arrested one day and will go to Saddam's security and under torture would just name me, and then I will be pulled innocent into this, and innocent people lost their lives.
Yeah, you were only a kid, though. I mean, that's crazy. How else did living under dictatorship manifest itself in your day-to-day life?
Well, it was a problem to be a Kurd because Saddam was known to have suppressing the Kurdish uprising in 1991, but even before then, in the 1970s and the 1980s, used chemical weapons to suppress the Kurds as part of a genocide campaign called Anfal, destroyed more than 4,000 villages. He took tens of thousands of people, buried them in mass graves, used chemical weapons in the city of Halabja, killing about 5,000 people. So fear was when will be the day where you will be rounded up as part of that genocide? When will you be rounded up, taken to jail because somebody was tortured? So it was manifesting in a variety of ways. Fear was the dominant factor.
Of course, no free press, no civil liberties, etc. But I think you mentioned to me when we were preparing to get together here that you used to listen to the radio, English language radio, to find out what was going on outside of your part of the world.
Right. So 1989, 1990, 1991. So before I went to college, we had a little radio that I used to try to listen to Arabic service of BBC and Voice of America. But then when I went to college later, I relied on the same resource to learn and improve my English.
Yet despite these horrors that you describe of living under Saddam Hussein, Iraq was not a backward society, right? It was an advanced middle-class society with strong education and public health sectors.
Absolutely. So there's more than one lens to look at Iraq, whether today or under the rule of Saddam Hussein. In the 1980s, Iraq and Baghdad was the envy of the Middle East in terms of advanced education.
People from across the region went to Baghdad.
Exactly, to come and study there, and some of the countries of the region were aspiring to be as developed as Iraq. But then it was also a brutal state where Saddam was in war with Iran, where Saddam was suppressing the Kurds, suppressing the Shia, suppressing the Turkomans.
So I vaguely remember in 1990, I was 15 years old, when I heard Saddam Hussein, probably I'd never heard of him before, invaded Kuwait. Iraq invaded Kuwait. Do you remember that, and what was your reaction to that?
I think the feeling on my part and a lot of other people was different, and it evolved. First, for me personally, it was a demonstration of how dangerous Saddam has gotten. He has just ended a war with Iran, and now he is invading he has invaded another country. Where would he go next? Of course, there was fear that he may go to Saudi Arabia and try to expand the operations. But there were also Iraqis who were actually seeing, okay, with the riches of Iraq and the riches of Kuwait in terms of oil, actually Iraq will be a more powerful economic country. That was not my thinking. I was more concerned.
Well, because the economy was in bad shape after the 8-year war with Iran, so...
Yes, indeed. And Iraq needed resources to rebuild, and there were economic tensions between Iraq and Kuwait over oil and other things. But from the part of the country where I was after actually the war in a way became a curse and a blessing, and we can unpack that if you wish.
It's at this time where the United Nations, at the behest of the United States and the United Kingdom, imposes the sanctions on Iraq. Prior to the first Gulf War, the sanctions were in place for several months. And for 8 months, I didn't realize this until recently, for 8 full months, Iraq could import no food at all. And all countries in the world were forbidden from doing any type of trade with Iraq. So we talked about how Iraq, despite living under this dictatorship, was a fairly prosperous and advanced middle-class society, well-educated, had strong public sectors in health and education. How quickly did you see the impact of these sanctions, which, as I said, cut off all food imports to Iraq for a full 8 months?
I think the impact started to unfold quickly, and how fast and how deep you were hit by it varied based on where you were in the country. So just a broader point about the sanctions. Before the economic sanctions of the UN, in Iraq, for people, were put in surviving mode. In surviving mode because of Saddam, because of politics, because of the brutal approach. You worried about your survival that way. The sanctions added this additional layer of survival because of economic reasons, where it was extremely difficult for people to find food. In the Kurdistan region in the north where I was at, it was it was a triple hit because, as I mentioned earlier, through the genocide of the Anfal campaign, villages were destroyed. That was the local economy, the source of agriculture and all of that. So that was wiped out. And second, there was the international sanctions that Iraq was put under. And third, Saddam also imposed an internal blockade on the Kurds as a way of penalizing them. The no-fly zone that the United States and the other allies imposed, he could not have his military invade the Kurdistan region again, but that was his way to penalize. Whether you are in the Kurdistan region or the rest of Iraq, salaries were no longer enough to pay for food. It changed the value of the society where people had to find other ways to provide food for their families. People started to take bribes, had to steal from their jobs, had to take on additional jobs. If you were a government, you tried to get a private sector job that was in direct conflict of interest with what you were doing.
Yeah, a lot of teachers quit their jobs, right? So they can work elsewhere to make money for food.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And were you hungry yourself? Was your family?
I was blessed where I did face hardship, but I think I still consider, despite all the hardships that I faced, compared to the stories of others that I have seen, I can still consider myself lucky and blessed. I've seen families who had to skip meals so that if you had lunch, then you had to skip dinner. If you had dinner, you skip breakfast so that another family member could eat. People had to sell everything they had, the furniture. Other people had to sell the doors in their home to provide for their families. In some very extreme cases, people had to sell body organs. And I cannot confirm this, but there were stories going around that some people had to sell a child so that they can have some source of income to help the rest of the family.
Yeah, there were stories too about women having to resort to prostitution for food and all. So you heard this, you saw this, and what was your understanding as to why this was happening? Were you aware that this was punishment for Saddam's invasion?
That's a really difficult story about what people knew. Obviously,
and I'm asking you to remember quite a far back too.
Right.
Human memory is not all that reliable.
Yeah.
But,
at the beginning, it was crystal clear this was brought on by Saddam's action. But as the pain started to hit the people, then it became more difficult and people to understand and say, and the question was, the international community knows Saddam does not represent the people. And it was him who inflicted wars on his people, on his neighbors. It felt that the sanctions were penalizing the people for a crime they did not commit, that somebody else committed. Saddam was not affected himself, survived, his family was doing well. So gradually, the frustration and the anger of the people started to turn against the international community and saying, you helped Saddam become the powerful actor he became. You are not helping us get rid of him, and now you are penalizing us because of his actions.
Do you feel like people, well, in the United States at the time, equated Iraq with Saddam?
Absolutely. I mean, what people, even to date, come across people who did not know what was happening inside Iraq. Saddam was the brutal lid on a pressure cooker that was Iraq. I just mentioned to you the genocide he did against the Kurds, the mass killing against the Shia, against other ethnic and religious minorities. It was a brutal police state. He certainly did not represent the people. And the people tried hard to rise up to him. There was revolutions, uprisings, but all the weaponry that he had amassed because of Iraq's wealth and all the countries of the West and the East that supported him, either because there was economic interest in selling him weapons or there was political interest in containing Iran. There was a variety of ways that they created that beast. And then when they sanctioned that beast, people did not think, the decision makers did not think about how is this harming the Iraqi people, or it did not seem that they cared.
So in 1993, this is just 3 years into the sanctions, the UN World Food Program and the Food and Agriculture Organization reported that notwithstanding the justification for their imposition, the sanctions have caused persistent deprivation, severe hunger, and malnutrition for a vast majority of the Iraqi population, particularly vulnerable groups, children under 5, expectant nursing women, widows, orphans, the sick, elderly, and disabled. And again, that is the UN World Food Program. And then in 1995, you get the Oil for Food program. Did that help?
Yeah, just on the earlier point, food from Baghdad did not flow. So this is the Kurds in the north were forced to now knock on the doors of Iran and Turkey for food because Saddam's blockade was not providing food. That in itself made other entry points for regional powers to have an influence inside Iraq and influence that grew after 2003. The rest of the country, Saddam instituted a monthly food ration program that would allow food to reach as many of the families as possible, but that was not available in the Kurdistan region.
I didn't know that, yeah, because the ration program was credited with staving off famine, but I didn't realize it was not available to you.
No, it was after the Oil for Food program was instituted that the UN mandate included implementing the Oil for Food program in the Kurdistan region. The rest of Iraq, the government of Iraq was buying the food and distributing the food through those programs. In the north, the UN was mandated to do that. But then Saddam had sway over the UN, prevented that money to be used for urgent needs of health and building infrastructure, and politicized the program that would support his Arabization program, where he would kick people out of Kirkuk and other provinces, kick Kurds out, and they would be resettled in the Kurdistan region. But what helped the Kurdistan region was international organizations had started to help the locals to rebuild in their villages, and the local agriculture market was starting to rebuild. But how Saddam was hurting that also not to flourish, he was not allowing the UN to buy the local wheat, for example. Then that became a secondary hit on the rural life and the local economy.
So while these sanctions were making life difficult enough, you also had Saddam Hussein adding his own layer of interference here.
Always.
Yes, always. So you were also aware, I assume, that all kinds of equipment, any kind of equipment that might be considered an industrial input, was prevented from reaching Iraq by the United States, often under this dual-use justification. To what extent were you aware of what was going on there?
I mean, I was aware that there was an issue with dual use, and of course, from the perspective of the people, they were not sure how some of these equipments could be dual use. The pain of the people was economic. It was about their daily lives. It was about survival. So it was difficult to understand. And then gradually, as some equipment started to be allowed, whether medical equipment or otherwise, what we were learning, for example, a medical equipment would arrive and the cable was not on, or the software that operated was not on. So a lot of these then sat in warehouses until after 2003, when the sanctions were removed and some of those equipment were started to be put to use, or they had expired and were never used.
And chlorine for water purification wasn't allowed because that could potentially have a dual use. And, vaccines, everything.
Again, I don't know the details of. Look, Saddam was a dangerous man. So I think the sanctions, I think it is abundantly clear by now, it is an imperfect policy tool. It helped in a certain way preventing Saddam from reacquiring weapons of mass destruction and chemical weapons.
He couldn't rebuild his military, that's clear. But
Exactly. So it prevented Saddam becoming a danger to the neighbors, but it also, the sanctions really destroyed a lot of values and transformed the Iraqi society in so many negative ways.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that. What about the fabric of society, the residual consequences? What did these sanctions do?
Yeah, so for example, in the 1980s, the Iraqi society, it was a proud society where it was a shame to steal. You wouldn't steal. The only instances of bribery I heard of was when there was somebody trying to get somebody out of Saddam's brutal prisons to help somebody escape. But the sanctions forced people to steal and get bribes and take illegal ways to earn an income to survive. Then by the early 2000s, that has become a system and a culture for the younger generation who has come to see these methods around them. It made it a culture, the values of the society to change. Fast forward to 2003 and all the billions that poured into Iraq through all kinds of contracts, and you had a corrupt elite taking the government. It became systemic, a culture and a system.
Yeah, so by 2003, the United States is about to invade and get rid of Saddam Hussein. Did you have mixed feelings about this? I mean, I spoke to Gaith Abdul-Ahad a couple of months ago, the Iraqi journalist. He said, well, sure, we wanted to get rid of Saddam. He was terrible. But at the same time, couldn't really be excited about another country invading you with all this military firepower.
Yeah, so look, my answer is to you is the Sarhang, the young man who was in Iraq under. So this is not Sarhang, the peacebuilder of today, or this is the view does not represent my organization. Living under dictatorship of Saddam, I was part of the larger part of the society that needed Saddam to go, and I did not see any other way that he could be removed. The answer to your question is really depends on the person. For me, removing Saddam was necessary. There was no other way without international help, international intervention. But for somebody who lost a son, a father, a family member, the answer to that question would be different.
In your view, has the world learned the lesson that sanctions of this magnitude are not effective at achieving their stated aims, but rather just punish civilians and innocent people? And now we have this idea of smart sanctions. I mean, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on sanctions, but from what I'm tracking, I think there has been improvement in how sanctions are thought about, how they are designed, where there is an attempt in the case of sanctions on Iran, in the case of the sanctions on Bashar al-Assad in Syria, to target them more towards the people in government, people who are implementing the policies of the system. But I don't think they have changed the fundamentals. The fundamentals is that Bashar al-Assad survived the conflict. He is now in a process of normalization, being welcomed back to the Arab League, regaining the seats of Syria in the Arab League, where he is welcomed in by countries of the region. We have the system in Iran surviving and not collapsing, while the people in both Syria and Iran are enduring great suffering as a result of sanctions that were brought upon them by the people who govern them. So sanctions remain an imperfect policy that hurt people more than probably the system.
You consider yourself a peacebuilder now for the U.S. Institute of Peace. What kind of work are you doing in Iraq? You were just there, and you continue to visit frequently, right?
Right. Yes. So I think regardless of what anybody thinks about the cause of the war, whether it was a just war, whether it was conducted rightly or wrongly, the war happened, and unfortunately, violent conflict has been a recurring problem in Iraq before the 2003 war. But I think from a peace-building standpoint, I represent the building hope. In this new Iraq, I think the removal of Saddam, the removal of the Ba'ath Party, the building of a new system for all its imperfections, it still gave the Iraqi a new opportunity. An opportunity, a young man and woman born today, not to live under dictatorship. Iraqi society in 2003 was about 25 million. Today, there's not an exact recent census, but the estimates put it at about 42 to 43 million. All those who were born after 2003 were born in a freer society. The 2019 protest movement, where people, the young generation of Iraq, poured to the street, many of them in Baghdad and the southern provinces, shows the potential of this society, this transformed society that was paralyzed under the Republic of Fear pre-2003, to have a shot at a different life. That had Saddam and the Ba'ath Party stayed in power, there was no opportunity.
The 2019 protests were about Iranian influence. Young people in Iraq were annoyed by Iranian influence in Baghdad, or was it simply the dysfunctioning of the Iraqi government?
To me, the 2019 protest movement, mostly youth under the age of 25, most of them born after 2003, represents the transformation in the Iraqi society towards democracy. If democracy is a function of a free society holding its institutions accountable, where you have institutions of the country protecting its people and sovereignty, I think the 2019 protest movement represented the most important part of democracy the society. This was the closest that the Iraqis have had an opportunity to form we the people in an Iraqi style. Of course, their demands were better services, providing job opportunities, fighting corruption, pushing back on external influence, particularly Iranian influence. This was the younger Iraqi generation exercising their freedom and holding public officials in Iraq accountable, as organic as it gets from an Iraqi society, that it was possible now. But also it tells a sad story where a society that was freed from Saddam and dictatorship, the response to the protest movement was brutal.
Yes,
There was killing of peaceful demonstrators through snipers, and even the tear gas canisters were aimed at them for maximum killing. But that did not derail the protest movement to become violent. And I think that is a success story in Iraq, a transformation that many people outside Iraq do not see or know of.
Are you worried about civil war returning to Iraq?
At any given moment, the ingredients for civil war in Iraq exist in the form of the many armed groups that are there, in the form of a lot of guns in the hand of the people. But I also believe since 2003, Iraq has its highest level of capital for peace today. The mindset for peace, the capital for peace, the actions for peace is higher than the balance for violence.
So how do you think Mohammed al-Sudani, the new prime minister, is doing? I mean, when he came to power, he promised to do something about corruption, which has been the problem no one has been able to solve.
Prime Minister Sudani has been in office for about 6 months now. He came from a political coalition that people have been unhappy with because they believe the political coalition that put him in power is supported by Iran and blocked a democratic alternative that came out of the 2021 elections. However, in the past 6 months, the prime minister has been growing on people by appearing like an honest man, that he is serious about wanting to change their lives and wanting to stand up for Iraq's identity, standing for Iraq's sovereignty. People understand that there is a complex situation that he has to deal with. So far, people are giving him positive marks, but the people are not giving the same positive marks to the political coalition that brought him to power. And they are worried that political coalition will get in his way as soon as he touches deep issues that affect their interests, whether it is money, whether it is power, whether it is guns.
That speaks to a problem about pillars of civil society. Corrupt states, autocratic states, and Nouri al-Maliki was criticized as an autocrat, nepotism, favoritism, corruption, rather than having, the structures of civil society and a functioning bureaucracy. You get my point? I guess that's where I'm wondering how far along the road Iraq is to getting to that point. Not that we don't have plenty of corruption here in the United States, of course, but...
Right. I think this is a great question, and thank you for asking that, because usually there's a black and white view to Iraq. Some people say it was wrong to go to Iraq, this was wrong to invade, Iraq cannot have democracy, or the Middle East cannot have democracy. But I think that's a black and white picture that is not representative of what Iraq is. A democracy is a representation of the diversity of a society, reflecting that in the system. A democracy is when the people hold public officials accountable. And I think Iraq has developed a civil society. That civil society is in the form of the non-governmental organizations that have formed through support and investment of the United States, European allies, and others. That civil society is what tribal leaders in Iraq, in every instance where the state was weak, whether it was the 2007-2008 awakening where the tribal in the Sunni area stood up to Al-Qaeda and fought terrorism, when they stood up to the best that they could against ISIS. When the state was weak, the tribal leaders that we worked with in our peacebuilding programs, they chose not to go to tribal tradition, which may have deepened conflict. Actually, they chose to the path of peace. There are religious leaders like Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, the Grand Shia cleric, who actually stood with the public protesters in 2019 and helped them gain some systemic changes. So there are new universities universities giving Western-style education. There are several elements of civil society at play that take responsibility for stability in the areas where they represent, that they try to apply pressure on the government where possible, and change the notion in the Middle East where everything has to be provided by the state. That is not how governance works, and I think there are more positive stories in Iraq that are untold.
It's interesting because you are telling a more positive story than, say, Gaith Abdul-Ahad did when I had him on the podcast a couple of months ago. In his view, Iraq is still a corrupt kleptocracy. You're saying it's not as bad as that.
I listened to your interview. It's a great interview. I have a lot of respect for him and for his work. And it's not black and white. He's right about the corruption and the sectarianism and the violence that occurred. And I can paint as a bleak of a picture as well. But there are these sides to Iraq that are still not resolved. But coming back to what I said earlier, you have two sides to the balance sheet. There is the negative, there's the corruption, there's the armed groups, but also there's the positive, the younger generation, the tribal leaders, the religious leaders, the women leaders that are transforming the Iraqi society. So Iraq is at a crossroad right now, and the battle for that future, will it go back to a republic of fear and corruption dominating, or it will have a more positive future that is being battled by the Iraqis as we speak, not through guns, but through more civilian means?
Well, I certainly hope so, because Iraq has seen nothing but war and suffering and strife since Saddam and the Iran-Iraq War. Iraq deserves a period of peace.
Certainly, and I think that in 2003, some people were surprised. They said, okay, Saddam was removed, the regime was removed. Why didn't the Iraqis grab that opportunity and build a more peaceful, stable country? Why the sectarian fight? Why allow Al-Qaeda and others take hold? But I think there were shock after shock, conflict after conflict bleeding into each other. They just did not give the Iraqi people a chance. But despite of the challenges of the past 20 years, again, my intention is not to paint a bleak picture or a rosy picture. My objective is to paint a realistic picture. In that difficult picture, the younger generation of Iraq represent the hope. That younger generation they are fighting for their future. They are not expecting the United States or any other nation to send their troops to fight for them, but they do hope that the United States and other countries will stand with them as they follow civilian means, as they try to have cleaner elections, as they try to take the energy of the youth into the political system. They still need international help.
And they have no living memory of Saddam Hussein, and that matters.
Yeah, most of them do not have a living memory of Saddam Hussein, but they do have a living memory of terrorism, ISIS ripping through their societies, and sectarian fights and corruption. I talked about the values of the society changing as a result of the sanctions, but where I draw hope is the younger generation. There are many of them who wants to fight that corruption. They want to change the value of society, and that is the source of hope for me in Iraq.
Sarhang Hamasaeed, we thank you for your time here and for the work you're doing trying to make peace stick in Iraq. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to talk about the U.S., China, South Korea, North Korea, Japan, a new Cold War with Guy Taylor and Andrew Salmon, who is our Asia Bureau Chief. He'll be joining us from Seoul. Guy is back from his trip to South Korea. He'll be joining us in the studio. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.